Welcome back to the Scotti-BYTE channel, and this is Scott. So one of the ways that I look at and determine the topics for a particular tutorial is if I can go out and Google it and I don't really find an immediate answer. And the other thing that I look at doing in every video is to try to present things by telling people what I'm going to tell them, and then tell them what I've told them. And even though that seems somewhat redundant on the surface, the purpose behind it is that everyone learns just a little bit differently. So with that in mind, today we want to talk a little bit about Home Assistant OS. And specifically, we're going to discuss Home Assistant operating system running in Incus. And so this is really for two types of users. It's for people that may be running another installation of Home Assistant, wanting to move to Home Assistant OS, or for a brand new user of Home Assistant. In my particular case, I use Home Assistant, but I only use it kind of as a peripheral because my primary home automation system is a Habitat Elevation Hub, and I share all of my devices from that Habitat over to my Home Assistant instance, which is running in an Incus Virtual Machine. So Home Assistant OS, otherwise known as HAOS, is a full appliance which includes components such as Home Assistant Core, Home Assistant Supervisor, and the add-on store. And so Home Assistant Supervised is another distribution, or I should say installation type, and it's a full-fledged Home Assistant, just like Home Assistant OS, but it is installed on top of either Debian 11 or Debian 12, and it includes Home Assistant Core, the Supervisor, and the add-ons. And so I was running that up until just recently here, and we got a notice about 4 days ago that Home Assistant Supervised will be deprecated at the end of December 2025. So another installation, or another installation type, I should say, is Home Assistant Container. And that's generally implemented in Docker, and it only includes Home Assistant Core. There's no Home Assistant Supervisor, there's no add-on store, no easy way to back up Home Assistant, and no update controls in the user interface, and so therefore it's considered to have a somewhat limited functionality. And then we have Home Assistant Core in Python. And so the beauty behind Home Assistant Core in Python is that it has no supervisor or add-on store, and it has minimal support, but the advantage is that you can load it on any particular operating system. So I would consider it to have pretty similar functionality to Home Assistant Container. So all 32-bit Home Assistant installations are being deprecated as of December 2025 as part of that initial announcement, where they're also deprecating Home Assistant Core in Python and Home Assistant Supervised. So the Home Assistant, Supervisor, and Core have the following attributes. Home Assistant Supervisor updates the Home Assistant Core, it stops and starts Home Assistant, and it installs updates and also runs add-ons. And Home Assistant Core executes your various automations, scripts, and scenes. And it also manages integrations like your MQTT message broker, and communicates with devices such as Zigbee devices, Z-Wave devices, Google, Alexa, Hue, Unify, and other types of devices as well. And in fact, I can even think that it communicates with Bluetooth devices. Of course, a limiting factor is that you have to have the appropriate radios wherever your Home Assistant Core is installed, because you need those radios to communicate with Zigbee, or Z-Wave or Bluetooth. So Home Assistant Core hosts something called the Lovelace Dashboard Graphical User Interface, which is the primary GUI for Home Assistant on the web interface. And then HA Core also maintains the registry database, which contains all of the entities, which are how you communicate to various device attributes, the histories of that communication, and also the ability to listen for various events in a real-time sort of mode. And then there are 4 HA installation types that I mentioned on the previous slide, and I have up until now run Home Assistant Supervised, and the primary reason that I did that is because it was easier to install into a virtual machine. So this is where I got the message on my Home Assistant Supervised that Home Assistant Supervised has been deprecated, and here it warns you that it's not going to receive any updates after the end of 2025, and it suggests that you update it to one of the other installations. And it's not that it won't stop working, but it's probably going to not receive any future support or updates at that particular point in time. And so I kind of encourage people, if you're running Home Assistant Supervised, to migrate to a newer version, and that's what we're going to talk about here. So then, obviously, having covered so many issues on Incus, the real question is, can you run Home Assistant in Incus? Well, in June of 2023, I presented a tutorial that was entitled LexD Virtual Machine for Home Assistant. And I've been running that Home Assistant Supervised that I covered in that video, which is that Home Assistant Supervised installation type. I ran it in LexD for a while, and then once Incus came out, I migrated all those containers in Incus, so I had my Home Assistant Supervised running in an Incus virtual machine. So I did a backup of my configuration on Home Assistant Supervised, and I began the migration process. So this tutorial is about how I installed HAOS on an Incus virtual machine. And it was easy to install HAOS on a QEMU virtual machine, which is the virtualization hypervisor for Linux. But since HAOS is not a standard OS, there were challenges. And what I mean by a standard OS is that you would get a distro that would come on an ISO, and you could perform an ordinary operating system installation. So HAOS on an Incus virtual machine doesn't support SSH to a command language interpreter, so there's no command line per se, like I could have SSH to my Home Assistant Supervised VM and been at the command prompt and upgraded the underlying Debian. And in fact, I did that to go from Debian 11 to Debian 12. And so therefore, it has no Incus shell command like you would have with the normal Incus virtual machine. And there is also no instrumentation for exposing network addresses and no ACPI, which I've heard some rumblings, but it's not for sure, that Incus version 6.14 might be providing ACPI support, which is the advanced support for power control. So we're going to learn how to install HAOS as an appliance, because that's what HAOS is, and we're going to learn how to install that on an Incus virtual machine. Here I have my fully configured and working version of Home Assistant Supervised running in an Incus virtual machine. And so our goal today is going to be migrating your Home Assistant wherever you have it installed, for example, on a Raspberry Pi, over to a Home Assistant OS installation running on an Incus Virtual Machine, or if you're not running Home Assistant at all presently, we're going to talk about how to install a new installation of Home Assistant OS in an Incus Virtual Machine. If you're an existing Home Assistant user, then you'll want to migrate your current configuration to the new server that we're going to build. So go into your Home Assistant, go down to Settings as I have here, go over to System, and then go over to Backups. You can either take a new backup or you can click on your automatic backups, which would be taking place by default. You can see here that I have an automatic backup that was taken a mere 12 hours ago. I'll click on the hamburger menu to the side of it, and I'll click download, and that download will appear in my default download folder. I've headed over to the Home Assistant GitHub page here, and this is the release page, and it is the release page specifically for Home Assistant operating system. Up here at the top, it has Home Assistant OS version 16.0, and it's release candidate 1. Since it's in pre-release, I'm going to go ahead and scroll down the page, and the last production release was Home Assistant version 15.2. And you can go down here in the list, and it will show you the various downloads. But since we're going to do these downloads from our Incus server, we won't be clicking on these to download them specifically. Here I am on one of my demo Incus servers, and if I perform an Incus list command, I have a couple of containers on another project I was working on. If I do an Incus version, my Incus server is running version 6.13, which is the latest as of June 2025. So the first thing I want to do is a wget command to go out to the GitHub project for Home Assistant operating system and to download the version 15.2. If you're watching this video in the future, you might want to see what the current version is that you need to download. So I go ahead and hit enter, and it will download that latest version now of Incus OS. And if I do an ls-al, we can see here that we have several files, but the file that we just downloaded is the HAOS generic, and it is an image.xz. So the first thing that we want to do with that is we want to go ahead and uncompress that file. In order to uncompress that file, we're going to do a unxz on that file name, and it will uncompress that file into a straight img file, which is a disk image. Now that the file's been decompressed, I can do an ls-l on HAOS asterisk, and it will go ahead and list the uncompressed image file with the extension of img. At this point, you might think that you would create an Incus Virtual Machine to host our HAOS. And it might be a command somewhat like this: Incus launch images :ubuntu /24.04, and we might call it HAOS, and we'll say --VM so that it knows it's a virtual machine, and with several other qualifiers. However, that's not correct, because as I mentioned, we're not going to be installing an image or installing an operating system. We're simply going to be using the image that we just uncompressed. That, in addition to the fact that HAOS normally runs on Debian, but since we're using the HAOS appliance, we're not starting with an operating system or installing an operating system at all. If you watched my video on creating an Incus Windows 11 virtual machine, you note that in that video I did an Incus init win11 VM, and I did a dash dash empty and dash dash VM so it would know that it's a VM, effectively creating an empty VM. And then the next thing you would think you would do was to take the image that we've just uncompressed and go ahead and connect that to that VM, and it would go ahead and work. I tried that many times and it simply didn't work. And the reason it didn't work is because there are not enough proper command switches to be able to set up the connection to that image to be able to run it properly. Incus has a tool that can allow you to migrate a disk image into an Incus Virtual Machine. And we need to install that tool with a sudo apt install Incus-extra, and I go ahead and enter my sudo password, and here it says that Incus-extra is already installed. Incus-extra includes a tool called Incus Migrate. So we're going to run a sudo on Incus-migrate. And it says the local Incus server is the target for our end container. The default is yes, and that is correct. And it says, what would you like to create? A container, a virtual machine, or a virtual machine from an OVA file or a custom volume. In our particular case, we're going to choose option 2 to create a virtual machine because Home Assistant OS needs all the services that an Incus virtual machine has, and a container is not sufficient. I'm going to go ahead and call my container HA-OS, meaning Home Assistant Operating System. I'll hit enter and it says, please provide the path to the disk partition or image file. In our particular case, that image file is this HAOS underbar generic -x86-64-15.2.img, which is the file that we decompressed. And does this VM support UEFI booting? The answer is yes. Does it support secure boot? And the answer here will be no. Since we want our Home Assistant to be offered out onto our main LAN, I'm next going to choose option number 2, which is override the profile list. And it says, which profiles would you like to include? And the answer is default, and we leave a space. And for those of you who've watched my Incus containers step by step, you know that we have created the bridge profile that allows you to present containers on an address on your main LAN. So I go ahead and enter default and bridge profile separated by a space. Then I hit enter, and at this point I can choose option 1 to begin the migration with the configuration described above. Now that Incus Migrate has completed, you can go ahead and do an Incus list, and we should see the container here, HAOS, listed. The default size of an Incus virtual machine disk is 10 gigabytes, and so I can use this command to override that by saying Incus config device override HA-OS root size equals 50 gigabytes, which I believe is more than enough to handle hosting the Home Assistant operating system installation. Let's start our HAOS instance with the command incus start HA-OS. Now that it's been started for a little while, if I go ahead and do an Incus list here, you'll notice that HAOS is never going to show an IPv4 address. And the reason for this is because the HAOS container was created from the appliance provided by Home Assistant, and therefore it doesn't have any of the internal instrumentation required to list the IP address. So you'll have to go out on your network and look around and see if you can determine what address that your new HAOS instance is running, and that will vary according to what network router that you are using. And so normally you might think that I could simply do an Incus shell over to HAOS, but the image is not running the internal instrumentation as I mentioned, so therefore the virtual machine agent isn't currently running, and so we don't have any way to do that. After having gone out on my network, I determined that this new Home Assistant OS instance is running at 172.16.1.70, which is an address on my network. And you're going to want to enter that address followed by a :8123 because port 8123 is the port that the web interface for Home Assistant runs on. Recall that at the onset of this video, I created a backup of my existing Home Assistant configuration. And so in this screen, we could choose Upload Backup and specify that file. And once it restores, this new Home Assistant OS installation would be identical to your original installation. And in my case, I had absolutely no problems doing that. Let's assume that you're a brand new Home Assistant user. You can click on Create My Smart Home, and at this point you're going to give your name and you're going to provide a username. In this case, I'm making my username also Scott, and then you can type in a password and then you can go ahead and confirm that password. We click Create Account and it goes off and creates your account. And then they'll have an option to specify your address so that you can have the geolocation things operate properly. After entering your address, there's an option to click off on basic usage and analytics if you want, and then you can click Next after that. At this point, it says we found compatible devices, and it will scan your network and find the devices on the network. So I'll go ahead and click Finish, and already it's starting to locate various devices on my network. If I go over to my Lex Console web management interface for Incus, and I look at my Demo-1 Incus server, it has 2 containers running and 1 virtual machine. If I click on that 1 virtual machine, there we see HAOS that is up and running, and it says that it has no OS. It can't really establish what that is. Again, that's due to instrumentation that doesn't exist inside the VM image. Likewise, we can't see the IPv4 or IPv6 address, but it does correctly report the current size of the root disk, which we set to 50 gigabytes, but it says it's 2.8 gigabytes at the moment, and that's probably just the used space. So we can click on HAOS, and one of the things that we can do here is we can look under instance actions and do an edit. And then here on boot.autostart, I probably want to set that equal to true, which means that anytime my Incus container or my Incus server starts, this particular HAOS instance starts as well. I can then go over to limits, and I can set up the number of CPU cores and the amount of memory that I want it to use if I wanted to do that. And then at that point, I can scroll down to the bottom and click Submit. And now I know that my container will auto start correctly. Now that being said, if we go here and we click the Stop button, this container will never stop. And the reason, again, is because we don't have a CPI instrumentation to do that properly. So in order to stop it from this interface, we would have to go select a forced stop operation.
Likewise, when I head back down to the terminal prompt and I do an Incus list, we also do not see the IPv4 address here or the IPv6 address. And just like in the Lex console, the instrumentation is not running inside of the HAOS image. So if we wanted to stop this container from the command line, we would have to do an Incus stop HA-OS and a -F for force it to stop now, since it cannot perform an ordinary ACPI shutdown. The proper way to do a shutdown of our HAOS virtual machine in Incus is to head over to Settings. And notice here in Settings it says that I have one unsupported system virtualization instance or image, and that is because I happen to be running on my test server demo-1, which is an Atom processor that does not fully support all the virtualization features. But if you're running a normal x86-64 processor like I am for my production instance, I do not have that problem. And to illustrate that, if I head over here to my Lab Dash menu and I go down to my production Home Assistant and I go down to my settings here, you will see that I do not have any errors on it. So headed back to our demo instance that we're installing, I don't think that we're really worried about this unsupported system. It's just the choice that I made in doing this demo. So now if we head down to System, we can go down to Hardware, and in System Hardware, in the upper right hand corner, there is a Restart Home Assistant. And you can go to Advanced Options and you can actually say Shut Down System, and I can say Shut Down, and that will perform a normal complete shutdown. And to prove that that's the case, if we head back to our Lex console here and we go back up to our instances and we head over to virtual machines, we should see the HAOS change from running to stopped shortly. And now after about a minute and a half, Lex console shows that the HAOS instance has in fact stopped. So I can go ahead and click on this HAOS once again and click on the Start button, and it will start the instance back up. Once I head back over to the GUI here, you can see that I have a Home Assistant is starting, please wait, and it comes back up again. Scott from the future decided to come back and interrupt this program and basically add to the video once I was already through with it. And so I'm going to do an Incus list here and show my HAOS Incus Virtual Machine for the Home Assistant. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do an Incus stop on HA-OS. And as I said, because of the lack of ACPI support, I'm going to have to do a -F to force, which isn't a great way to stop it, but hey, it stops it. And when I list it here, you can see that it's stopped. So if you've watched my Incus Virtual Machines, or Incus Virtual Machines Tricks, I think it is, or Incus Tricks, I forget how the thing is highlighted exactly. But in that process, I show you how you can have other Incus trusted servers. And so if I do an Incus remote list here, I went ahead and added my server called Mondo. And so now I have a trust with Mondo. So given that trust with Mondo, I'm going to go ahead and move this virtual machine that I just stopped over there. And I'm going to say Incus move HAOS over to Mondo, and when it gets moved over there, I think I'll just call it Home Assistant. And I use a -- mode equals relay, which is actually a much faster way to move an Incus virtual machine. Now that that's transferred, and really that only took about 30 seconds, if I do an Incus list, you'll see that that virtual machine is now missing from here. So I'll go ahead and exit off of demo 1 and I'll do an SSH over to Mondo. And here on Mondo, if I do an Incus list, we'll see that Home Assistant is over there. So now I'll do an Incus start, and I'll go ahead and grab the name Home Assistant by double clicking on it and do a Shift Control C and a Shift Control V and then hit enter. And now if I do an Incus list, Home Assistant is now starting up on the Mondo Incus server. If we head over to our web browser and I simply enter the same IP address that I used on demo-1 for the Home Assistant OS container with :8123 for the port number on the end, and I hit enter, it goes into Home Assistant. And you'll notice this time that we don't have any warnings in the settings area because this processor has full x86-64 support, and so I'm not seeing any errors. Recall that right after the Incus migrate, I performed a command incus config device override HAOS root size equals 50 gigabytes. And you'll notice down here that in storage, it says that it's only using 7% of the drive space and 43 gigabytes are free. And if I float over the top of the disk space here someplace, there it goes, it will call out the actual disk size at 3.5 gigabytes used and 48.5 gigabytes available. And so we have our full disk size for our HAOS Incus Virtual Machine. One of the first things that a new user of Home Assistant should do is to enable the Home Assistant Community Store, or HACS for short. So in order to do that, go down to your profile icon, which is in the lower left-hand corner. In my case, it says Scott. I click on that, and then I scroll down to the option that says Advanced Mode, and I toggle Advanced Mode on. Next, I head back to Settings, and I click on Add-ons. And under Add-ons, I want to go ahead and click the Add-on Store. And under the Add-on Store, I'm going to type in SSH. And I want to click on the Terminal and SSH add-on. And then when that comes up, I want to go ahead and click on the Install option. Once the Terminal and SSH add-on has installed, go ahead and click Start. Notice that the Terminal and SSH add-on says Start on Boot, and that's a good thing. Go down here to where it says Show in Sidebar and turn that on as well, and you'll notice that it shows in the sidebar. Now we can go ahead and click on Terminal, and it will start up the Home Assistant terminal. To install the Home Assistant Community Store, or HACS, we want to go ahead and paste in a script with a wget command here that will run the HACS script. And now that that script has run, we're going to need to restart Home Assistant. So to do that, go over to Settings, go over to System, go in the upper right hand corner and say Restart Home Assistant, and then click Restart. Once Home Assistant restarts, you might still be in the System part of Settings. Go ahead and click Settings again, and at the top level, you want to go ahead and click Devices and Services. And then you want to click Add Integration, and here is where you want to type in HACS. And HACS should now show up since we downloaded the code for it. Click on HACS. There are all these disclaimers in HACS since it's not a part of the original Home Assistant, but instead a community store. So check off the box that says, I know how to access my Home Assistant logs. I know that there are no add-ons in HACS. I know that everything inside HACS, including HACS itself, is custom and untested by Home Assistant, and I know that if I get issues with Home Assistant, I should disable my custom components. And those are just disclaimers, but HACS adds a lot of added value. Once you've checked off all those boxes, go ahead and click the Submit. Now go ahead and click the URL here, which I've already done, and then you want to make a copy of this authorization code. So I'm going to copy that. I go over here to my GitHub, and I'll go ahead and say continue. And it says this authorization was requested from blah blah location, and I'll go ahead and say authorize HACS. So that is now connected to my Home Assistant instance, and when I go back over here, it will say that it's actually done. And so here I can say put this in a particular area. I'll just go ahead and say skip and finish, and now I have HACS configured on my system. From here in the left bar, I can simply click on HACS, and it will go in and show me all of the various types of integrations that HACS offers. Another useful thing that we're going to want to do is to go back to settings and then go to add-ons, and in the lower right hand corner where it says add-on store, click there. And when you come up with the search bar on the add-on store, go ahead and type in file, and it should come up with file editor. Click on file editor, then click on install. Once the file editor is installed, it should be set to start on boot, and then you also want to click on show in sidebar. And then you can click on the file editor to go ahead and launch it, and we'll say start add-on. Next time it boots Home Assistant, this will be immediately available, but the first time we invoke it, we have to wait just a little bit. Once the file editor is up and running, go ahead and click on this folder you see up here to browse the file system. And the first file we want to go ahead and edit is the configuration.yaml file, which is kind of the master file for configuring all of the major settings in Home Assistant. If you have assigned a custom domain name to your instance of Home Assistant and you have it defined inside of Nginx Proxy Manager, in order to get Home Assistant to actually work, you're going to need to put in some additional code into configuration.yaml. And it's going to look something like this: http : and then use x forwarded 4 is true, and trusted underscore proxies, and then you give the address of your Nginx proxy manager. In my case, my Nginx proxy manager address is 172.16.1.215, and you want your address of your Nginx proxy manager to be listed here. And so at this point, if we wanted to save that, since the save is in red up here, that indicates we have unsaved changes, and you would go ahead and click save in order to save it, and it will say file changes have been made successfully. I think that by having the file editor, HACS, and the terminal installed, that gives you a good start to configuring Home Assistant. Now, in addition to this, you notice it hasn't detected very much on my network, and the reason for that is because we would need a USB device that would be plugged into our Incus server and then connected to our Incus Virtual Machine for the Home Assistant OS in order to be able to do things like see Zigbee devices on the network or see Z-Wave devices on the network. And right now it's detecting things just based on the protocols we have available, which really just means straight IP. So in summary, Home Assistant OS is an appliance, and an appliance differs from an operating system or an application because you don't go through any installation process, and instead you simply have an image that you run which has been pre-configured. And so an appliance is designed as a systems integrated solution that blurs the lines between an application and the underlying OS. HAOS provides no user interface to the underlying OS via SSH, and although the official SSH and web terminal add-on provides containerized access to control HAOS, it doesn't provide direct access to the underlying OS because the attitude is that there are no user serviceable parts inside, which results in a more reliable end solution for the users. And HAOS in an Incus Virtual Machine lacks instrumentation to see the underlying network interfaces or to perform advanced configuration and power interface, otherwise known as ACPI functions. And as a result, in order to perform a proper shutdown, you have to go into the HAOS web interface to perform a complete power shutdown, but that's not really a limitation. And in fact, HAOS running in an Incus Virtual Machine performs every one of its functions exactly as it would if it were installed on a bare metal machine with no limitations and no errors. Anyway, that's it for today. Please subscribe and like to the video, and don't forget to hit your notification bell, and we'll see you next time.